Thank you everyone for joining us today on this beautiful day in this fantastic space. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Dixon. We have 15 minutes and I have about 500 questions for you, as I'm sure everyone else here does as well. So I won't waste any time in getting started. As this is Her Power, I want to talk first about the connection between gender and national security. Research is really stunning on this question and really alarming. In countries where the larger the gender gap is in countries, and this is defined by experiences and opportunities for women, the more likely a country is to be involved in violent conflict. And the higher levels of violence against women, the more likely a country is to not comply with international norms and treaty agreements. Given this incredible and very alarming connection, how do you factor this into your thinking and your work in the IC?
And I think people would be surprised to know that we do factor it in very much, because we know that women's involvement in society has a huge impact on the development, on economics, as well as on what the foreign policy perspectives are of the nation. And we do it in a couple of ways. And probably the most visible way that you would see is we put every year out a trends report. And the trends report looks at possible futures and gets society as well as our community to think about, what could be happening in the future. And it has a section in there on women, women's rights, women's roles, and how we might see that developing further on. We also have done a report on just the future of human rights more broadly, but women's rights and specifically going forward. And so we are looking at this very much to make sure that we're not missing out on important trends in any countries, in any regions, because as you said, it really does impact the stability as well as the prosperity of those nations.
That's incredible. I want to turn now to Ukraine and talk about in the run-up to the Russian invasion in 2022, I think one of the really startling and interesting roles that the US played was the rapid declassification of intelligence and the sharing of that with allies and partners, but also with the public, really, sounding the alarm about Russia's intentions and what ultimately did happen. Can you talk a bit about the genesis of this? I mean, how did this decision come around to go so public with these warnings, and what was the thinking behind it?
And I'll start with saying it was the administration's interest in making sure that we could have this conversation more publicly with allies, with partners, and with the public. And so there's always been a history of the intelligence community declassifying things, but to your point, not only was it more rapid, but it was far more expansive than we've done in the past. And it was so that we could get the world to see the potential of what was going to happen, and hopefully getting allies aligned and seeing what our intelligence was saying, prevent something that unfortunately we weren't able to prevent. But knowing that Russia, and Putin in particular, has a history of using disinformation and misinformation to justify activities like invasions, we wanted to make sure that the world remembered that as well. And so talking about the fact that you could see false flag operations, you could see statements coming out of Russia to try to justify these things, that we saw this build up that was unexplained, and that others were seeing, but may have interpreted it in different ways. And so part of it was to help our conversation with allies and partners, but the rest of it was also like, if we can't prevent this from happening, if this isn't a deterrent, and talking about it more broadly, how do we at least educate more people so that they will be able to judge for themselves what they're hearing and what they're seeing.
And how novel was this approach?
The quantity of things that were declassified was very new for us. It sort of put us into a new realm of having to think about our intelligence from the moment we collect it to the moment we write about it, in terms of it may need to be needed for a different, it may need to be needed to be shared more broadly. So how do you think about that as you're writing about it? Don't just write the classified part, write something that actually can be shared at different levels. And so that is something that our community is trying to adjust to and figure out how to do that the best. Because there's enough to just write about in the classified realm, but now to have to also be thoughtful about that up in advance, it's a mind shift.
Obviously the warnings up until the invasion were, tragically for Ukraine, incredibly spot on. Russia did ultimately launch a full-scale invasion. But one aspect to the warnings that was off the mark was how the war would unfold from the invasion. And whenever I speak to military analysts, the first thing they say is war is inherently unpredictable. Sure. So I appreciate this is a very difficult thing to foresee, but what we were hearing for the administration was that Kiev could fall in a matter of days. There really was this expectation that Russia would go in and take Ukraine, or at least a large chunk of it, incredibly quickly, which ultimately, 2 years in, still has not come to pass. Why was this expectation off the mark? And what is the kind of process in the IC if a prediction has failed to pass?
Not only is it difficult to predict militarily what can happen, but the sort of the will to fight and the public support are very difficult to analyze in advance. And I think we've seen some examples of times when we sort of had an expectation that hasn't resulted in the outcome being what we thought it would be. And a lot of times it comes down to just the nuances of what people will do and where people are pushed to limits and what choices they end up making. So we continue to try to learn from this so that we can be better in the future and provide these perspectives to policymakers. It's always something that we say is a possibility, but clearly it was not what we expected in this case. And you mentioned 2 years plus in, we're still going, and you still see a lot of support.
I suppose you're trying to analyze extremes of human behavior, both in the invading force, but also amongst the Ukrainians.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
One last question on Ukraine. One of the other interesting things in the run-up to the invasion was the amount of information made available through open source data and by private companies going straight to journalists and straight to the public. A great example of this is Maxar Images, which has incredible satellite capability and was sending satellite images of Russian tanks, of Russian troops, straight into the inboxes of journalists. And then, of course, you also have groups like Bellingcat, which have made incredible use of social media, hacked and leaked emails to track Russian spies across Europe. How does this change the way you work in the IC when the public and the media now has so much information at its fingertips, but also other governments and also non-state actors as well?
It's a great way to phrase the question, too, because we have seen over the course of many conflicts how important it is for the public to sort of be involved and to be able to see things for themselves. And so I applaud those out there that are sharing things broadly. We in our community have over the course of the last decade. I mean, if you look back in the past, we were criticized for not being more open to using open source information. I think now, like many in the world, we see the power of it, and we're trying to build infrastructures that allow us to use it effectively, using our trade craft, using the way that we would approach analysts. We're not approaching it any differently because it's a different kind of data source. We want to make sure that we're approaching it the same way we would approach the other data that we collect. That's been a little bit of a shift. We're trying to build it up, but it's something that our analysts, our collectors are very much taking into consideration these days, and there's a hunger for it. At the same time, we also know that there is a lot of concern with the intelligence community's use of information like this, whether it's open source or commercially acquired, and we're trying to address that, trying to make sure people know that no, we're following the laws. What underpins this is the values and the principles that America, espouse. So how do you make sure that we can raise the trust by the public and by policymakers and by lawmakers so that we can have access to this information? Because to your point, Amy, everyone else does. Do you want to disadvantage the government by not allowing us to have the same information that adversaries might have? And it's true that, yes, the government can do a lot with this information, but we also are putting frameworks in place to make sure that people can understand what we are and aren't doing, and we hope to publicize more of that in the near future.
How do you integrate, open source data sets into the IC whilst maintaining those legal, ethical, and normative standards that you mentioned earlier?
Part of it is making sure that we've got there's a lot that you can do with open source out in sort of unclassified realms. A lot of what we do is in our classified systems, and we don't want to replicate the internet and bring everything in. And so how do you make sure that you're able to leverage the analysis of both places? And it does take some more sophisticated IT thinkers to be able to figure out how to do that. But that's exactly what we want to do. Leverage as much of the open source information as we can, use it to supplement on the one hand, but it can also be a starting point where you're then adding in classified information later. So it really depends on the topic, whether we start with the open source or whether we start with the classified, but we're trying to be able to do it a lot more effectively than we've done in the past.
I mean, part of what has fueled this explosion in open source research, both in the public sphere and the media, is just new technologies available, leading to an explosion in data. According to one analysis I found, each year we generate as a world, 500 million tweets, 294 billion emails, half of which I feel like are sitting unread in my inbox.
And mine.
Right. 4 million gigabytes of Facebook data and 65 billion WhatsApp messages. How has this just explosion in the amount of data changed the work of the IC? Because when I think, a lot of us think about intelligence agencies, you think about finding information, right? Our picture we have in our minds is very framed by Hollywood, by the Cold War, covert operations. Now, in some ways, you have the opposite problem. It's finding the needle in the needle stack, as I've heard people say. So how does this change your job of managing and just sorting through all of this information?
It's exactly as you described it. We have to be able to go in and very quickly triage through a lot of information. So some of it is using the tools that are out there, the artificial intelligence tools for summarization. But we want to get beyond that and try to figure out, what is the power of these tools and how can we have them help our analysts point to the things that they need to sort of focus on first. How do we ensure that we can move through the data really quickly so that they can spend time thinking and being thoughtful about it, and they're not spending all their time just searching and seeking and triaging. So we really see a good interface and partnership between the humans and the machines, the human-machine teaming, to be able to do these kinds of things. But we're very excited about the possibility, but it is daunting when you think of how much information is out there and how very little of it probably will be useful, but the things that are will be critically important to make sure they get into our cycles and our systems.
I mean, you mentioned AI there. I mean, how is AI, it's going to change the way we all work, but how is it changing the way that you work within the intelligence community?
I've already seen really good uses of algorithms and tools that are being applied to these really large sets of just text information, for example. How do you go through and summarize a lot of content to know where you should focus yourself? I've also seen it used to good effect in the machine learning to good effect on images. Looking through, trying to find particular things in the images. Machines are really good at finding anomalous things in large data sets, so being able to use it that way, and a couple of our agencies are focused on that. Being able to also use it for translations to get us the basics of what people are talking about or what the languages are saying when it's not in English. Tools can help us with that because there's not enough linguists in the world to be able to cover everything that's happening. So how do we more effectively leverage technology to help us do our missions?
As we mentioned, AI has so much potential to revolutionize the way we all work. I also assume that it's going to revolutionize the way that adversaries work and non-state actors. And I'm particularly interested in that non-state part because there's a lot discussed about how Russia might use this for disinformation, the race with China for the competitive edge in AI. But what about terror groups, gangs, cyber groups? What are your concerns about how they may harness the power of these new technologies to revolutionize the way they work?
We've talked a lot about the democratization of technology and how really it's out there for everyone and not just for those who are able to develop it in their own countries or in their own organizations. It's worrisome because I think that those of us who are creating the technology are also thinking about it through our ethical principles and trying to figure out what the guardrails are and the biases. And if someone's handed technology that they didn't develop, I don't see the same sort of thoughtfulness put up. And so being willing to use it in situations where we wouldn't use it, being willing to use it, as a decider of whether someone's life is taken or not. I could see others doing that long before the United States would do anything like that. And that it can definitely be very, very worrisome. You see it a little bit in the proliferation of UAVs and how many unmanned aerial vehicles are out there being used for conflicts. Same thing with AI. It's low barriers to entry. If you have access to the internet, you can have access to very, very powerful models that can help you create content that can, stir up the tensions within other societies like our own. And I'm absolutely certain that would be very attractive for someone to use to include terrorist groups and others.
And just quickly, we have a minute left. What do you see as some of the best approaches to kind of keeping AI as a force for good rather than falling into those kind of uses?
Part of it is making sure that international communities are talking about it, that we're talking about how do we create standards that we're all following? Where do we keep the weights of the models that form the basis of these algorithms? How do we talk about sort of those guardrails and building in anti-bias checks for the algorithms that we're developing? You see a lot of researchers talking about those things, and now it's a matter of if we're going to make the algorithms available for more people, we probably need to build them in from the beginning. We can't assume that others are going to add them afterwards. And so how do we as communities doing this kind of work figure out how to sort of future-proof the fact that they're going to get out there in the wild and others are going to use them and may not have the same sort of protections in their minds before they use such technology. But I'm optimistic. I think the researchers out there are being very thoughtful about it.
Well, thank you for ending our conversation on an optimistic note. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Amy. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Please now welcome to the stage Congresswoman Young Kim for a conversation with FP's executive editor,